Stories about unexplained scary situations. Story 1. The Sixth Sense. In those years, when Alex was studying at the university, his life seemed calm and measured. He rented a small but cozy studio apartment in a quiet neighborhood that was considered safe even at night. The apartment was close to a convenience store and McDonald's, which for a night owl like Ilya was ideal. At night, he often sat at his textbooks or computer, working on projects and essays. And when hunger took over, he would simply walk down the stairs and find himself at the door of a store or cafe within minutes. One night, when the clock had long since passed midnight, Alex sat at his desk and wrote an essay that was due the next day. He was tired, but work was in full swing. Closer to 2 in the morning, he suddenly felt very hungry. Usually at times like this, he didn't hesitate to pack up and go get a snack. As luck would have it, there was nothing but dry cereal in the refrigerator, so Alex decided to walk to the supermarket for something more nutritious. He habitually put on his jacket, took his wallet, and opened the door. But as soon as he crossed the threshold of the apartment, a strange feeling came over him. It was no ordinary fear. He felt his heart clench in his chest and a shiver run through his body. The unexpected anxiety intensified, and Alex froze in place. He felt something dark and cold spill inside him, as if an invisible voice was warning him, "Don't go." He felt like just going back inside and locking himself in the apartment. Alex stood on the doorstep, trying to rationalize this strange feeling. Glancing out the window, he saw an empty street. The light of street lamps illuminated a familiar intersection, and not a single sign of danger was visible. But despite this, the feeling of unease wouldn't let him go. He realized that it could just be fatigue or stress from studying, but an inner voice kept telling him that he shouldn't go now. After a few minutes, Alex surrendered to this incomprehensible fear. He took off his jacket, went back to the apartment, and got some dry cereal from the cupboard. The food wasn't what he wanted, but it was better than ignoring his anxiety. Falling asleep that night, Alex still felt oddly relieved, like he'd avoided something he had no idea about. The next day, some unpleasant news awaited him. There was talk at the university about the fight that had taken place last night at the intersection near the supermarket. Several drunken men had gotten into a scuffle, and one of the students had been badly beaten. Alex froze when he heard this. The intersection where everything happened was the very place he was going to go that night. He was overwhelmed by the realization of how close he had been to the incident. If he had ignored his feelings and gone to the store, he could very well have been in this student's shoes. Story 2. In the Power of Nightmare. Every day for Jack was similar to the previous one. Work, short meetings with friends, coming home, and long hours alone. He never complained about his life, accepting routine as an inevitable part of growing up. Lately, however, something had begun to disturb him, like something hidden in the shadows. At first, it was just scraps of strange thoughts before bed, as if his consciousness was transmitting vague alarm signals. Then came the nightmares. The first night it was a normal dream, which was quickly forgotten. But after a week, the nightmares became more intense. They filled his nights, as if they had invaded his reality. In one of these dreams, Jack found himself in a strange darkness. He felt something pressing on his chest, the air becoming sparse, and then he began to suffocate. In the dream, someone invisible was squeezing his throat with force, and Jack tried desperately to break free. He struggled, but the invisible hands kept pressing, depriving him of the ability to breathe. Everything around him became more and more blurred. The sounds disappeared. Only the tight pressure on his throat did not let go. Jack suddenly woke up with a cold sweat on his forehead. The first thing he felt was an unrelenting pain in his neck and the terrible sensation that he was still choking. He reached for his throat on automatic and froze. His hands, they were clutching his own neck. His fingers were closed around it as if he were strangling himself. The realization came instantly, but it only increased his panic. He didn't understand how or why it had happened. He couldn't bring himself to unclench his hands right away, and when he finally did, it seemed to him that it wasn't all just a dream. When he sat up on the bed, breathing heavily and intermittently, the room was dark and eerily quiet. The moonlight faintly illuminated the objects around him, giving them an ominous shape. At that moment, it seemed to him that something from his dream had seeped into reality. He couldn't shake off the sensation and couldn't find an explanation for his actions. Nothing like this had ever happened to him before. Nightmares were just nightmares. They couldn't penetrate the real world. But that night, something had clearly changed. The next day, Jack tried to forget what had happened, writing it all off as fatigue. Perhaps work or stress played a cruel joke on him. He decided that he would not pay any more attention to it and tried to continue his usual routine. But during the night, the dream caught up with him again, and then another. Each subsequent nightmare was similar to the previous one. The same suffocating darkness, the same hands on his throat, and the same struggle to breathe. Jack woke up feeling his own fingers squeezing his neck again and again, as if he were trying to repeat the dream in reality. Each time, this feeling became more and more creepy and frightening. On the third day after the first nightmare, Jack began to notice that strange things were happening around him. His mood was tense during the day, and he found himself increasingly nervous for no reason. He felt as if someone or something was watching him, as if the thin line between dream and reality was beginning to blur. Sometimes he saw shadows in the corners of his apartment that seemed all too real to him. Sometimes he heard strange sounds, as if someone was invisibly present nearby. A few days passed, but the nightmares did not leave him. They got worse and worse, and each time he woke up with his hands on his neck. Eventually, he became afraid to go to sleep. He tried to stay awake as long as possible, but fatigue always took over. The time between nightmares became shorter, and the dreams themselves became scarier. Now, in addition to the suffocation, Jack began to see a figure that stood behind him all the time, but every time he turned around, it disappeared. Each time its outline became more and more distinct. Jack could no longer understand where the dream ended and reality began. The feeling that something sinister was present in his apartment grew stronger. He began to see a glimpse of this figure even during the day, but every time he turned around, it was gone. His physical condition was deteriorating. The constant lack of sleep, fear, and nervous tension made him feel worse and worse. His strength was gone. His thoughts were confused. He tried to go to the doctors, but all the tests were normal. Stress, fatigue, they said, advising rest. But how can you rest when every time you fall asleep, your own mind becomes a trap? One night, Jack realized that something had to change. This time, the nightmare was especially vivid. The hands clutching his throat were no longer his own. They were someone else's cold fingers. And when he woke up, the feeling of those fingers was still on his neck. The fear that the dream now did not end even after waking made him realize something from this world was gradually taking hold of him. Jack's story would probably remain unexplained. No one ever found out what happened next. For some time, he stopped contacting, and his apartment, when friends and relatives tried to visit him, turned out to be locked. Over time, talk of him began to fade, but there was still a shadow of the story on his acquaintances that no one could forget. Story 3: 2 Floors, 2 Fathers. Elizabeth lived with her family in a condominium where they had 2 apartments, one on the 7th floor and one on the 8th floor. Despite the oddities of such living, it was quite convenient for the family. The apartment on the 8th floor was used as the main apartment, and the 7th floor was used for storing extra things like groceries and seasonal clothes. Sometimes it was necessary to go there for something, but it seemed like a small thing because the distance was only 1 floor. That evening, when it was already dark outside the window, the family gathered for dinner. The atmosphere was cozy. The aroma of home-cooked food was wafting around. Everyone was discussing the events of the day. But suddenly, the mother noticed that the ice cream, which she had prepared for dessert, had run out. She asked Elizabeth to go down to the 7th floor and fetch it from the freezer. This task seemed as routine as it always did, and Elizabeth, not suspecting anything unusual, took her keys and headed downstairs. As she descended to the 7th floor, She noticed at once that the floor was dark and deserted. The corridor lights flickered faintly, and the silence spilled over the entire space like a lingering fog. There was nothing wrong with that, though. This was their floor, and she felt safe here. There was a couch in the hallway, and as Elizabeth stepped closer, she suddenly noticed an indistinct figure sitting on it. Her heart twitched for a moment, but soon she recognized the silhouette. It was her father. He was sitting quietly, staring straight ahead, as if he were thinking about something. The only thing that seemed odd was that she had seen him upstairs eating dinner not long ago. What is he doing here? Elizabeth thought, but the thoughts were quickly dispelled. Maybe he had come for something he needed and decided to rest. She turned on the light, and yes, it was definitely her father. Without any suspicion, Elizabeth went to the freezer and, opening it, asked her father if he had keys, since the doors were usually automatically locked. There was no answer, however. He continued to sit silently, paying no attention to her. She was a little alarmed by this behavior, but she shrugged it off, thinking that perhaps her father was just too absorbed in his own thoughts. Taking the ice cream, Elizabeth headed for the elevator and went upstairs. When she entered the 8th floor apartment, she was in for a strange surprise. At the dining table, completely calm, sat her father, continuing to eat dinner as if he had never gone out. Elizabeth stopped abruptly, unable to believe her eyes. How could he have gotten up here so fast? This thought kept her in suspense. Her father continued to sit at the table, and around him everything was as before. The family was discussing the events of the day. No one noticed anything unusual in it. Unable to bear the inner tension, Elizabeth blurted out, "How did you get here so quickly? I just saw you downstairs." Everyone present turned to her in confusion. Her father calmly replied that he hadn't been out since dinner had started. Her mother and brother confirmed his words, assuring her that he had been at the table the whole time. But how could that be possible? Elizabeth was convinced that she had seen him on the 7th floor, and it could not have been a hallucination. She began to tell what had happened, how she had come downstairs, how she had seen him sitting on the sofa in the dark, how he had not answered her words or the question about the keys. The family listened to her carefully, but no one believed her. Everyone thought she had just imagined it, or perhaps she was too tired. But a fire of fear was already burning inside Elizabeth. She knew it was her father, but if he wasn't there, then who was sitting on the couch? Elizabeth decided not to go to the 7th floor alone anymore. Story 4. A moment between worlds. When Frances was a teenager, the days went by one after another, each one similar to the last. School, lessons, breaks, and long evenings with his favorite video games. It seemed that nothing could break this monotonous but habitual rhythm. One day during lunch break, Francis and his friend decided to spend time in the schoolyard as usual. The friend was diligently throwing a ball into a basketball hoop, while Francis was sitting on the pavement playing on his Nintendo DS. At that moment, nothing foretold strange events. He was so engrossed in the game that he stopped noticing the world around him. Only scraps of phrases reached his consciousness. One of them was a friend's question, whether he could hit the ring from the middle of the court. Francis, without taking his eyes off his screen, replied, "Try, but I don't think you'll succeed." He was so deeply immersed in the game that the world around him seemed to have disappeared, dissolved into the background noise. It seemed as if nothing in this moment could change, but suddenly a voice intervened in this train of thought. It was a familiar, warm, and yet dislocating sound. His father's voice. "What are you talking about?" Francis heard. He looked up sharply, trying to realize what was going on. The first thing that struck him was that in front of him was not a schoolyard and a basketball hoop at all. He was sitting on a soft rug in the living room of his house. There was silence all around, interrupted only by the quiet sound of the television in the background. Francis looked around slowly, feeling a vague uneasiness sweep over him. His father was sitting on the sofa nearby, looking at him with slight surprise. Francis himself was in exactly the same pose he had been in earlier in the schoolyard. He had the same game console in his hands and the same game level on the screen. He even remembered exactly that he was in the same place in the game world where he had been moments before. Time seemed to slip past him, transporting him from the schoolyard to his home without any explanation. The sense of reality was slowly returning, but with it came the realization that something was wrong. Francis remembered every detail, every moment of his previous activity on the school playground, the sounds of his friends, the whistle of the wind, even the smell of the asphalt. Everything was so real that he couldn't understand how he had suddenly found himself at home. Maybe he'd fallen asleep, but he didn't remember closing his eyes or feeling tired. Everything had happened so quickly that he hadn't had time to realize the displacement. Nevertheless, his father hadn't noticed anything strange. It was an ordinary evening like thousands of others. His father continued to watch television, and Francis decided not to share his strange experience. He just went back to the game, but the thoughts of what had happened didn't let him go until the evening. The event seemed so absurd and incomprehensible that Francis replayed the whole day in his head several times, trying to find a logical explanation. Maybe it was a dream, but then why were the sensations so vivid and real? He felt the touch on the asphalt, saw his friend throwing the ball, heard his voice. For days, Francis could not get the event out of his mind. He tried to figure out what had happened. Was it a vision, a temporary malfunction, an illusion, or something else? Gradually, the strange incident began to disturb him more and more. He tried to compare his memories of the school playground and the moment in the living room. The sensations matched, but his mind refused to accept such clear discrepancies in reality. He decided not to tell anyone about it. At first, he thought he would share the incident with his friends, but each time he stopped himself. How could he explain it so he wouldn't look crazy? Every time he remembered it, his heart sank. Everything seemed so real, but also so ridiculous at the same time that the very fact of it seemed frightening. Perhaps his memory had played tricks on him, or his consciousness had momentarily transcended the normal perception of time. Story 6. The owl-nosed Brandon had never believed in ghosts until he encountered unexplained phenomena in the house where he had to live for several years. The house was old, built back in the early 20th century, and at first glance was no different from other houses in the neighborhood. But it was in it that Brandon was to learn what it meant to live under the same roof with something that could not be explained by logic. It began gradually. Brandon was a student, often staying up late at night doing homework or reading books. Usually, when he was alone in a room, he had a strange feeling, as if someone was watching him. He would look around but see no one. Gradually, this feeling became his constant companion. It was especially strong when the door to the corridor was left ajar. Brendan could see someone pass by the door, a dark shadow, an indistinct figure that seemed to disappear into the darkness. But when he turned his head to get a better look at the someone, the hallway was empty. Some nights the owls his family kept behaved strangely. They slept in his bedroom, usually quiet and still, but there were times when suddenly both would spread their wings, open their beaks, and stare fixedly at the door as if they saw something. Sometimes they would sit like that for several minutes without making a sound. More than once, Brandon had watched them anxiously, but he tried not to pay much attention to it, thinking it was just bird instincts. But one night something happened that turned his view of reality upside down. There was a massive closet in the house that had belonged to Brandon's great-grandfather. It was a real antique, at least 100 years old, huge, heavy, and seemingly beyond any physical strength. It stood in his brother's bedroom. The closet had always inspired respect with its massiveness. No one had ever imagined how it could have been moved, much less dropped. But in the middle of the night, Brandon and his family were awakened by a loud rumble. Running into his brother's room, they found that the closet, this giant piece of wood, was lying on the floor as if someone had pushed it. No one could explain how this could have happened, for the cabinet was too heavy to just topple over. Brandon felt that something strange was going on in the house, something that could not be explained in any reasonable way. His sister confessed that she had heard someone or something pushing the cupboard before it fell. Every day the tension in the house grew. Brandon's mother and brother complained more and more often about strange sounds and sometimes even the presence of someone. They said they felt as if someone was quietly creeping around the house, scaring them. Several times they claimed to have seen the shadow of a man, a tall man, about Brandon Height, but each time they saw him, Brandon was either in his room or not in the house at all. It was so strange that at first they simply accused him of playing a trick on them, but it soon became clear it wasn't Brandon. Something or someone was wandering around the house, going unnoticed except for those moments when his silhouette glimpsed in the hallways. All this turned the family's life into a constant expectation of a new, unexplained phenomenon. Brandon began to notice that even the furniture in the house sometimes seemed to change its position. One day, his mother said that she found pictures on the kitchen table that were lying in the attic. No one in the family had taken them, and no one knew how they ended up on the table. It was an old family photo of Brandon, great-grandfather. The face in the photo looked strangely familiar. The shadow that everyone saw in the house resembled his figure. But the creepiest moment occurred when the family decided to sell the house. The buyers didn't seem to sense anything unusual. The transaction went smoothly, and the new owners moved in. A few months later, Brandon and his family decided to visit the old house, as they had been invited to a meeting with the new owners to discuss the family's legacy. As they sat down at the table, the owner suddenly turned pale and started talking about the strange things that were happening in the house. He thought he was going crazy as he saw shadows and heard sounds that could not be explained.